Introduction. The fragile accord. The sky above Hadron 4 burned in hues of gold and violet as the twin suns descended behind jagged peaks, painting the alien wilderness with an ethereal glow. The dense thickets of cobalt-leaf trees swayed gently, their tendrils brushing against each other with a soft hum, a sound that unnerved the human station at Camp Halcyon. It wasn't the beauty of the alien world that set them on edge, but the knowledge of what lurked within. The Cryal, apex predators of the planet, were a species of terrifying precision and strength. Their bodies, resembling a blend of feline agility and reptilian resilience, moved like living shadows across the terrain. Standing nearly 7 feet tall when on their hind legs, their sleek, scaled forms and glowing amber eyes earned them a reputation as both hunters and warriors. Among the galactic species, they were feared and revered, rarely interacting with others unless it benefited them. And yet, here they were on the outskirts of the human settlement, watching. Dr. Elena Hartley, a xenobiologist and the de facto leader of the camp, stood at the observation platform with her second-in-command, Lieutenant Aaron Wells. The two of them observed the Cryal through binoculars. They hadn't approached yet, but the group was growing larger each night. "They're waiting for something," Wells muttered, lowering his binoculars. His military uniform, worn with pragmatic ease, was streaked with dust from patrols. "This isn't just curiosity. Cryal don't congregate like this unless it's mating season or there's a threat to their territory." Elena frowned, brushing a stray lock of auburn hair from her face as she studied the figures. She had spent years studying alien behavior, but the Cryal were an enigma. "They're not displaying aggression," she replied. "No territorial calls, no hunting patterns. If anything, they're hesitant. Yeah, hesitant like a pack of wolves sizing up a campfire," Wells quipped, though his tone lacked humor. "And you want to go out there?" Elena glanced at him, her hazel eyes steady. "I'm a scientist, Aaron. If they wanted to attack, they would have done so already. I need to understand why they're here. And if they decide your dinner?" Wells folded his arms, his stance protective but resigned. He knew arguing with Elena was like trying to stop a river's flow. "I'll gear up. We're not letting you go alone." The two descended the platform, the camp bustling around them. The other 10 members of the team were a mix of scientists and engineers, all uneasy under the Cryal's silent vigil. It had been weeks since their last scheduled supply drop, and the isolation weighed on them. Yet it was the presence of the Cryal that made everyone glance nervously at the tree line. As they prepared for the meeting, the distant sound of a Cryal howl echoed through the air, a sound that sent shivers down every human spine. It was not a call of aggression, but something far more poignant, a cry of distress. Elena tightened the straps on her exploration suit, determination hardening her features. Whatever the reason for the Cryal's behavior, she intended to find out. Wells handed her a pulse rifle. "Just in case?" She nodded, but deep down, she doubted any weapon would make a difference if the Cryal decided to attack. Still, she held the rifle with practiced ease. The Cryal were predators, after all. The first of their kind to interact with humanity had called them soft prey, with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. But that initial impression had shifted over time, especially after the siege of Ethon, where humans had stood side by side with alien allies, earning a reputation as fiercely loyal and startlingly resourceful. But loyalty and resourcefulness might not mean much to the Cryal. Not here. Not now. Elena, Wells, and a small escort team stepped into the twilight, walking toward the waiting figures with equal parts caution and resolve. The air between the humans and Cryal crackled with tension as the two groups faced each other for the first time. And then, as if compelled by some unspoken decision, one of the cryouts stepped forward. Cradled in its arms was a cub, its tiny body trembling, and its fur matted with what looked like blood. Elena's breath caught. This was no ordinary encounter. This was something else entirely. And Chapter 1. The Silent Plea. The cryout holding the cub stepped closer, its massive frame silhouetted against the fading light. Despite its size, there was something delicate in the way it cradled the young one, an action that felt paradoxical coming from a species known for its ferocity. The cub emitted a faint whimper, its cries so soft that it felt fragile against the backdrop of the alien wilderness. Dr. Elena Hartley froze for a moment, her heart pounding. The camp's floodlights cast a stark glow on the cryout's dark scales, and for the first time, she could see the strain etched into its features. The predator's body, usually poised and lethal, sagged with what looked unmistakably like exhaustion. Wells raised his pulse rifle slightly, the tension in his arms visible. "Dr. Hartley, I don't like this. They're too close." "Lower the weapon, Lieutenant," Elena said firmly, not taking her eyes off the cryout. "You'll escalate things if they feel threatened." Wells hesitated, but her unwavering tone won out. With a reluctant nod, he eased the rifle down, though his grip remained tight. The rest of the team behind them stood frozen, their weapons held in white-knuckled grips, unsure whether they were facing a diplomatic moment or an impending massacre. Elena took a cautious step forward. The cryout's glowing amber eyes locked onto her, unblinking. "You're hurt," she said softly, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. She gestured slowly to the cub. "And so is your child." The cryout tilted its head slightly, a gesture that mirrored curiosity, or perhaps skepticism. It growled low, a sound that resonated in Elena's chest like the rumble of distant thunder. Her translation device, embedded in the collar of her suit, struggled to decipher the complex tonal language. The only word it managed to pull through was help. The plea hit her like a jolt. The cryout were apex predators, proud and solitary. The idea that one would seek aid from another species, least of all humans, was almost unthinkable. But here it stood, defying every behavioral model she'd ever studied. She raised her hands, palms up, in a universal gesture of peace. "We'll help," she said, her voice clear. "Let us help." The cryout hesitated, its eyes narrowing as it scanned her face, searching for deception. Behind it, the rest of the group shifted, their tails lashing anxiously. There were at least 15 of them now, their forms blending into the shadows of the forest. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the cryout stepped forward and knelt, placing the cub gently on the ground. The small creature whimpered again, its eyes barely open. Its fur, softer and thinner than the adult scales, was matted with a viscous green fluid. Blood, Elena realized. Its tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Elena knelt slowly, her movements deliberate as she examined the cub. It was burning with fever, its body trembling with weakness. "It's septic," she murmured, glancing back at Wells. "We need the med kit now." Wells hesitated, his eyes darting to the other cryout, who were watching with predatory intensity. "You're sure about this?" "Yes," she said firmly. "Go." With a sharp nod, Wells turned and signaled one of the team members to retrieve the supplies. The tension in the air was palpable as Elena focused on the cub. She knew the risk, knew that if the cub didn't survive, the crowd might lash out in grief or rage. But she couldn't let that fear dictate her actions. When the medkit arrived, Elena worked quickly, cleaning the wound on the cub's side. It was a deep puncture, likely from another predator. An infection had already set in. The cryo hovered behind her, its low growl vibrating in the air as it watched her every move. "I need more light," Elena said. Wells barked the order, and another team member adjusted a portable floodlight, illuminating the scene. The cub flinched at the brightness, its tiny claws flexing weakly. "It's okay," Elena murmured, her voice soothing. "You're going to be okay." The cub's whimper softened, as if it understood. Elena worked with steady hands, injecting antibiotics and applying a salve designed to accelerate healing. Finally, she bandaged the wound and covered the cub with a thermal blanket to stabilize its temperature. When she finished, she leaned back on her heels and exhaled. "That's the best I can do for now," she said, glancing up at the cryo. The adult stepped closer, its massive frame casting a shadow over her. For a moment, she thought it might lash out, but instead, it bent its head low, its glowing eyes fixed on the cub. It let out a soft, crooning sound, its voice filled with an emotion Elena could only describe as relief. The cub stirred, its tiny body curling slightly under the blanket. It wasn't out of danger yet, but the immediate crisis had passed. The cryo straightened, its gaze meeting Elena's. There was something in its eyes that she couldn't quite define. Respect, perhaps? Gratitude? Whatever it was a bridge, a connection forged in the unlikeliest of circumstances. Wells stepped forward cautiously, his voice low. "They're still watching us document. What now?" Before Elena could answer, the cryo leader growled softly and motioned with its tail. The others began to move forward, their steps slow but deliberate. Elena's team tense, but she held up a hand. "They're not attacking," she said, her voice calm. "They're trusting us." One by one, the cryo approached, each one carrying a cub. Elena's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a plea for help. It was an act of faith, a gamble born of desperation. And now, the humans were responsible for the most vulnerable members of a species that had always been humanity's predator. She didn't know whether to feel honored or terrified. All she knew was that the night was far from over. Chapter 2. The Pact of Shadows. The camp had transformed into something out of a surreal dream. The cryo stood like sentinels at the tree line, their glowing eyes fixed on the humans, who worked with a tense urgency to tend to the fragile cubs now under their care. Despite their towering forms and lethal presence, the predators made no move to approach further. They simply waited, watching every motion with unnerving intensity. Elena knelt beside a makeshift medical station, where 3 cubs lay bundled in thermal blankets. Their wounds varied, from punctures and lacerations to signs of severe malnutrition. She worked tirelessly, her gloved hand steady despite the weight of the situation. Wells stood nearby, his rifle slung but his posture rigid, eyes darting between the forest and the cryo leader, who remained closest to the camp. "I don't like this," he muttered, his voice low but tight. "They're just standing there, like they're judging us." "They probably are," Elena replied without looking up. She adjusted a nutrient for the smallest cub, its frail body barely moving under the blanket. "We're performing triage on their young. If we fail, we're as good as dead." Wells crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "You realize what this means, right? They're trusting us with their future. The apex predators of this planet, handing over their most vulnerable. That's not normal." "Nothing about this is normal," Elena shot back, exhaustion creeping into her tone. She straightened, her hazel eyes meeting his. "But they came to us. They chose us." "Why?" Wells asked, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. Why humans? They could have left those cubs to die or handled it themselves, but they didn't. What makes us different? Elena hesitated, the weight of his question hanging heavy in the cool night air. She didn't have an answer, not yet. Instead, she turned back to her work, her focus sharpening. Let's make sure we're worth the trust they've given us. The unspoken agreement. Hours passed as the team worked tirelessly. Blood samples were analyzed, injuries treated, and makeshift incubators set up for the most vulnerable cubs. Every so often, Elena would glance at the cryo leader, who hadn't moved from its spot near the edge of the camp. Its amber eyes burned with an inscrutable expression, a mix of vigilance and expectation. Finally, as dawn began to creep over the horizon, Elena stepped back from the last cub and wiped a hand across her forehead. She was exhausted, but the cub's conditions had stabilized. For now, they were alive. She turned to Wells, who had been standing guard throughout the night. It's done. We've done all we can. Wells nodded, his expression grim. Now what? We hand them back and hope we don't get ripped apart. Before she could respond, the cryo leader stepped forward, crossing the invisible boundary that had separated the two groups all night. The other cryo tensed but did not follow, their tails swaying nervously. Wells raised his rifle instinctively, but Elena placed a hand on his arm. Wait, she said firmly. Let it come. The cryo leader stopped a few feet away, towering over Elena. Up close, its presence was overwhelming. The sharp angles of its scales, the rippling muscles beneath its sleek frame, the faint shimmer of scars etched across its body. Yet its posture was calm, almost reverent. Elena swallowed hard but stood her ground. Your cubs are stable, she said, her voice steady. She gestured to the medical station. They'll need time to heal, but they're strong. They'll survive. The cryo tilted its head, the motion eerily human. Then, to everyone's shock, it lowered itself onto all fours and bowed its head, a gesture that sent a ripple of murmurs through the human team. What the hell is it doing? Wells whispered. I think. Elena hesitated, her heart racing. I think it's thanking us. The cryo straightened and stepped closer, its gaze piercing as it studied Elena. Then it spoke, its voice a deep, resonant growl that the translation device struggled to keep up with. Humans, it rumbled, the word raw and unfamiliar in its throat. Protect. Fight. Care. No other species does this. Elena's breath caught. The simplicity of the words belied their weight. She nodded, her voice soft. We protect because it's right. It's who we are. The cryo leader's eyes flickered with something like understanding, or perhaps approval. It let out a low growl, not of warning but acknowledgement. Then it turned and gestured with its tail, signaling the others. The cryo pack moved as one, stepping forward and gathering their cubs with surprising gentleness. The humans stood frozen, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. But as the last cub was lifted into the arms of its parent, the leader turned back to Elena. You saved our future, it said, its words halting but clear. Crowd, do not forget. With that, the pack retreated into the forest, their forms vanishing into the morning mist. The humans watched in stunned silence until the last shadow disappeared. Aftermath. The camp was eerily quiet in the wake of the encounter. The team exchanged uneasy glances, their relief tempered by the weight of what had just transpired. Wells finally broke the silence. You think they'll come back? Elena stared at the spot where the cryo had disappeared. I don't know, she admitted, but I do know this. We've changed something. They see us differently now. Yeah, Wells muttered, shaking his head. Let's just hope that's a good thing. Elena turned her gaze to the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of gold and violet. Deep down, she felt the magnitude of what had just occurred. They had built a fragile bridge between two worlds, one born not of treaties or trade, but of trust. And trust, she realized, was the strongest pact of all. Chapter 3, Tested Bonds. The days following the Cryos' retreat passed in a tense, uneasy calm. The humans of Camp Halcyon resumed their routine, though it was clear that no one truly felt at ease. The memory of the cryo lingered like the echo of a distant storm, and the question of their return loomed over every conversation. Dr. Elena Hartley worked tirelessly in the camp's lab, analyzing the data she'd gathered during the Cubs' treatment. Blood samples, tissue scans, and biometrics revealed insights into cryophysiology that had eluded the scientific community for decades. Yet, even as she pored over the findings, her mind was elsewhere. What happens now? Wells asked one evening, leaning against the doorframe of the lab. His tone was casual, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. Elena didn't look up from her work. We wait, we learn, and we prepare for the possibility that they'll come back. They will, Wells said confidently. I've seen it in the field before. Animals don't just ignore what you did for them. They remember. Elena glanced at him, her hazel eyes thoughtful. They're more than animals, Aaron. They're sentient, intelligent, and now they see us as something different. Not prey, not rivals. Something else. Something they might depend on, Wells added, folding his arms. That's a lot of pressure. Elena sighed, leaning back in her chair. I'd rather they depend on us than see us as a threat. Before Wells could respond, the camp's alarm system blared, its sharp tones cutting through the quiet night. Red lights flashed across the compound as the team scrambled to their stations. Elena and Wells bolted out of the lab, joining the others at the observation platform. Through the thick cobalt trees, shapes emerged, their movements fluid and purposeful. The cryo, one of the engineers muttered, his voice trembling. Elena's breath caught. This time, the pack was larger, nearly 20 strong, their imposing forms casting long shadows in the moonlight. At the front was the same leader, its amber eyes glowing with an intensity that made her heart pound. What do they want now? Wells muttered, gripping his rifle. Let's find out, Elena said, already moving toward the gate. Stay calm. No weapons. The team hesitated but obeyed, lowering their firearms as Elena stepped forward. The cryo leader watched her approach, its gaze sharp and unwavering. Behind it, the rest of the pack stood motionless, their tails flicking in synchronized rhythm. When Elena stopped a few meters away, the leader raised its head and let out a low, rumbling growl. The translator in her collar processed the sound, spitting out fragmented phrases. Danger, hunt, threat. Elena frowned, her pulse quickening. What kind of threat? She asked, keeping her voice steady. The leader's growl deepened, its tail lashing. Others. Not cryo. Killers. The word sent a chill down her spine. She turned to Wells, who had moved closer, his expression grim. What do you think? She asked. Sounds like they're warning us, he said. Or asking for help. Elena nodded, her mind racing. If there's a threat to their territory, it could be a threat to us, too. The cryo leader stepped forward, its towering frame casting a shadow over Elena. It lowered its head slightly, fixing her with a piercing stare. Come, Fight! Her stomach twisted at the command. The cryo weren't just warning them. They were calling for an alliance. Into the wild. Despite the risks, Elena made the decision to follow the cryo. A small team, led by her and Wells, ventured into the wilderness, their gear packed with essentials for survival. The cryo moved ahead of them, their silent strides blending seamlessly with the terrain. It was both unnerving and awe-inspiring to witness their mastery of the environment. Hours passed as they traversed dense forests and rocky cliffs, the alien landscape glowing faintly under the twin moons. The tension among the humans was palpable, but the cryo leader's presence was oddly reassuring. It glanced back occasionally, ensuring the humans kept pace. Finally, they reached a clearing and the cryo stopped abruptly. The leader raised its head, sniffing the air before letting out a low, guttural growl. The rest of the pack spread out, their postures tense and alert. "What is it?" Wells whispered, scanning the area. Elena didn't need to answer. A low, chittering hiss, echoed through the clearing, sending a shiver down her spine. Moments later, creatures emerged from the shadows. They were unlike anything she'd seen before. Six-legged beasts with sleek, insectoid bodies and razor-sharp mandibles. Their black carapaces gleamed in the moonlight, and their eyes glowed with an unnatural blue light. They moved with a predatory grace, their hisses rising in unison. "Hostiles," Wells muttered, raising his rifle. The cryo snarled, their tails lashing as they formed a defensive circle around the humans. The leader growled a single word: "Fight." The creatures charged, their movements a blur of speed and precision. The clearing erupted into chaos as the cryo met the attack head-on, their claws and teeth flashing in the moonlight. Wells and the other humans opened fire, the pulse rifles lighting up the night with bursts of blue energy. Elena stayed back, her heart racing as she watched the battle unfold. The cryo fought with a ferocity that was both terrifying and mesmerizing, their teamwork seamless. But the creatures were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. One of the beasts broke through the line, its mandibles snapping as it lunged toward Elena. She stumbled back, fumbling for her sidearm, but before she could fire, the cryo leader leapt between them. It roared, its claws raking across the creature's body in a single, brutal motion. Elena stared in shock as the leader turned to her, blood dripping from its claws. It growled low, its eyes fierce. "Human safe." The word sent a surge of determination through her. She raised her weapon and joined the fight, her shots precise and deliberate. Around her, humans and cryo fought side by side, their alliance forged in the crucible of survival. Aftermath. When the last creature fell, the clearing fell silent, save for the ragged breaths of the survivors. The ground was littered with the bodies of the insectoid beasts, their blood staining the soil. The cryo stood victorious, their bodies battered but unbroken. The leader turned to Elena, its glowing eyes meeting hers. Together, strong, Elena nodded, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion. Together, as dawn broke over the horizon, the humans and cryo stood side by side, their bond no longer one of mere necessity, but of mutual respect. For the first time, predators and prey had become something more: allies. Final chapter: The Legacy of Trust. The days following the battle were a blur of activity and reflection. Back at Camp Halcyon, humans and cryo worked together for the first time in recorded history. The alliance born in the clearing had changed the dynamic between the two species, shattering centuries of mistrust and fear. For the humans, The aftermath was a test of diplomacy and endurance. For the Cryal, it was a profound shift in perspective. They had allowed another species to witness their vulnerability, their needs, and their strength. The healing exchange. Elena spent most of her time documenting the encounter. Every wound tended, every word exchanged with the Cryal leader, every detail of the insectoid creatures was logged meticulously. The beasts were classified as Carathics, a subterranean predator species, thought to be extinct on Hadron IV. Their sudden emergence and overwhelming numbers suggested an environmental disruption, though its cause remained a mystery. The Cryals stayed near the camp, their presence no longer looming but protective. They guarded the perimeter with silent vigilance, their amber eyes ever watchful. The humans, initially uneasy, slowly adjusted. The sight of a Cryal cub chasing a human engineer's repair drone drew laughter for the first time in weeks. One evening, as the twin suns dipped below the horizon, Elena stood at the edge of the camp, staring at the Cryal leader. It was crouched near the tree line, grooming one of the cubs. She approached cautiously, stopping when it raised its head to watch her. "We didn't expect this," she admitted, gesturing to the camp behind her. "When we came here, we thought we were intruding on your territory. We never imagined this." The Cryal leader tilted its head, considering her words. "Territory, important," it growled, its tone deliberate as it wrestled with the human language. "Cubs, more." Elena nodded, her chest tightening. "We didn't think you'd trust us with them." The Cryal let out a soft growl, almost a purr. "You protect, fight, care. Humans, strange, but good." She smiled faintly. "Strange, but good. I'll take that as a compliment." The leader regarded her for a long moment before speaking again. "Cubs, remember. Crow, remember." The weight of the words settled heavily on Elena. This wasn't just an exchange of survival. It was the beginning of something far greater. A legacy of trust that would ripple through both species for generations. A shared future. Weeks later, as the camp prepared for the arrival of a supply ship, the Cryal leader approached Elena one last time. It carried the smallest cub, now healthy and strong, in its arms. Behind it, the rest of the pack waited, their gazes steady. The leader placed the cub on the ground and gestured toward Elena. "You hold." She hesitated, overwhelmed by the gesture. Slowly, she knelt and extended her arms. The cub trotted forward, its tiny claws clicking on the ground as it nuzzled into her chest. Elena held it gently, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't name. "Why?" she asked softly, looking up at the leader. "Why trust us?" The Cryal stepped closer, its amber eyes locking onto hers. "You save weak. Fight strong. Share pain. No other does this." The simplicity of the statement struck her. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't its technology or its resilience. It was its ability to care, even for those who seemed so different. It was a trait that had bridged the gap between predator and prey, turning them into partners. The leader growled softly, a sound of finality. "Cub safe. Now." Trust grows. Elena placed the cub gently back on the ground, watching as it scampered to its parent. The Cryal leader straightened, its imposing form silhouetted against the rising suns. "You are allies," it said, the word heavy with meaning. "Not prey. Never prey." Elena swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The Cryal leader nodded once, then turned and led its pack into the forest. The humans watched in silence, their hearts heavy with the gravity of what had just transpired. A new dawn. When the supply ship arrived, the team shared their findings with the broader scientific and military communities. The reports were met with skepticism at first. Humans and cryo cooperating? It seemed unthinkable. But the data, coupled with Elena's detailed accounts, were undeniable. The cryo became more than a galactic curiosity. Their trust in humans became the foundation of a fragile but growing partnership. The two species began exchanging knowledge, resources, and, most importantly, understanding. Years later, Elena would look back on that fateful night when a predator placed its future into her hands. She would remember the cubs, the battle, and the words of the cryo leader. Humanity, she realized, wasn't just a species of survivors. They were protectors, bridge builders, and caretakers of the fragile bonds that connected all life. And on a distant planet under twin suns, even predators learned